to CounterPunch Radio. This is CounterPunch co-editor Joshua Frank, and I'm joined today by my co-host Erik Wallenberg in Chicago. Before I pass it over to Erik to introduce himself, I would like to remind everybody that is listening today that if you enjoy what you hear, if you like the CounterPunch Media Project, please head on over to our website at counterpunch.org to donate for as little as $5 a month. I think that's less than a coffee at Starbucks. You can get access to CP Plus or subscriber area, where you'll find original material every week by some of your favorite writers like Jeffrey St. Clair, Julie Wark, Ray Atchison, and many, many more. You'll also receive big discounts on books and merchandise. So it's a great way to keep us afloat, and we cannot survive without your support. So Erik, how are you doing, man?
I'm good. Thanks for having me here, Josh. I'm excited to be with you and with CounterPunch Radio. I'm a longtime reader of CounterPunch, going back to 2000 and the global justice movement, and then through all the ups and downs of the past 24 plus years of anti-war movements and immigrant rights movements. And it's hard to keep track of all of the things, all of the movements. But I'm excited to be here. I'm a worker owner at Pilsen Community Books. It's a cooperatively owned bookstore here in Chicago. I'm also an editor at Science for the People, a magazine that we relaunched about 5 years ago from the original that dated back to the late 60s, early 70s. It was an organization and a magazine, and it is again today, and excited to be doing that work. And I'm a historian by training. So I'm excited to be here to think about all of these big questions facing us in the world today, and excited to be talking with you about them.
Awesome. Well, we're really excited to have you, and let's get going with our first guest.
Okay, we're so excited to have Silky Shah with us today. Silky is the author of Unbuild Walls, Why Immigrant Justice Needs Abolition. Silky has been working as an organizer on issues related to racial and migrant justice for over 2 decades. Originally from Texas, she began fighting the expansion of immigrant jails on the U.S.-Mexico border in the aftermath of 9/11. And in 2009, she joined the staff of Detention Watch Network, a national coalition building power to abolish immigrant detention in the United States, and now serves as its executive director. Her writing on immigration policy and organizing has been published in Truth Out, Teen Vogue, and several edited collections on immigration and prison abolition. Silky, we're so happy to have you here. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, before we start, we were hoping you could say a bit more about what Detention Watch does and how you came to this work. So tell us a little bit more about yourself and your connection to this struggle for immigrant rights and prison abolition, just to give our audience a sense of who you are and what the work's all about.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Texas. I grew up in Houston, and a city with very, very vibrant immigrant communities. Very normalized for me. I went to undergrad in Austin, Texas, and I was like the sort of 9/11 happened while I was an undergrad. And so it was like that era of kind of starting to understand the war on terror and how it was operating, and being concerned about the roundup of especially Arab, Muslim, and South Asian people after that period. I myself am South Asian. My family is from India. I think just sort of like, whatever. I was like an activist kid. And I think the thing that sort of started to become clear at that point is like we were, making the case against obviously the Iraq War, but also making the case against the growing detention system. And I started organizing with a group called Grassroots Leadership. And we were just seeing essentially a prison boom, like a post-creation of DHS, post-9/11 prison boom happening at the border. And I was like a quote unquote criminal justice advocate, like my organizer, like trying to address the issue of private prisons or address, et cetera. But actually every single prison I was fighting, the people who are in them were immigrants. And so we were kind of siloed in these different worlds around criminal justice advocacy. And then in 2005, we connected with Detention Watch Network as organizers and started learning about, that there was actually a lot of people across the country working on the issue of detention. At that point, like nobody knew what immigrant detention was. And everybody, anytime I would mention it, people would be like, oh, you work on Guantanamo. And I was like, well, not quite. But so that's the thing. We connected with Detention Watch Network, and it was kind of like a lifeline, because all of a sudden now we could have both conversations on concerns around criminalization and also on immigration enforcement, and they weren't siloed from each other. And, that sort of tracks with how Detention Watch Network came together. So in 1997, it was founded after the passage of two really draconian immigration laws that passed during the Clinton era. And it has grown since then. It became like a formal membership coalition in 2005. And so that's whenever I started connecting. I eventually, as he said, joined the staff in 2009. But we basically were a sort of network trying to bring people who cared about detention together to share information, to learn about it. And then once I came on staff, it's the first time we had an organizer, we were starting to campaign around these questions. And eventually by 2012, kind of embraced an abolitionist stance around detention, which I, write about in the book, and I think was really, really precipitated by the Obama administration's approach to immigration enforcement. So we do sort of we really believe in bringing a lot of different groups together. So it's a network of legal service providers, grassroots organizations, people directly impacted by the system, policy organizations, law schools, et cetera, coming together, agreeing to the idea that actually we don't believe people should be incarcerated while going through immigration proceedings, and believing we have to have a multi-pronged approach. So it's both like grassroots organizing, advocacy at the local, state, and federal level, that sort of network building piece, the base building piece, but also narrative, and really trying to push back against all the frames that constantly tell us that immigration is a public safety issue and we need to ramp up enforcement at the border, and et cetera. And so trying to really push a more abundant vision, like getting away from a scarcity mindset. And yeah, so we work with groups across the country. We do a lot of work to shut down detention centers. I think our work is starting to shift into stopping expansion again, and some other things.
That's great. Can you expand a little bit on the mandatory detention? You write about it in the book, talking about it under the Clinton administration in the 90s and this normalization of immigrant detention. And can you talk a little bit about that longer history of detention and what, abolition means in this context when we're talking about immigration in the U.S.?
Yeah. So, the sort of current detention system we have, immigrants have been detained, incarcerated periodically throughout U.S. history, but for many years, since the 1950s to the early 80s, for the most part, detention was rare. And if somebody was, targeted by Immigration and Naturalization Service, they would be let go within a day or two and not spend months or years sometimes in detention, which is what we see now. So at that point, it was a period of time, and that's where we started to see sort of confluence of things. One, this very large migration of especially Black migrants from the Caribbean coming, which has sort of precipitated the expansion of detention, and specifically for Haitian migrants. And there was just essentially this sort of indefinite de facto mandatory detention happening of Haitian migrants. And a lot of people were like, hey, actually, this is kind of racist and it's a problem. And to kind of combat that, what ended up happening was that the US government said, well, we're just going to apply this to more people. So then they started detaining especially Central American migrants who were fleeing US-backed wars in the region. And so it started to expand. And this is sort of what Reagan did, where it was like, we're just going to put in this policy. And actually, Giuliani was integral to it. And put in this policy of sort of de facto mandatory detention, but then start to shift, as they normalize it, shift it and make it law. And so by 1988, and this is really height of the war on drugs, and the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988 is when we first see mandatory detention in law. Mm-hmm. And that means that somebody basically can't have any sort of due process on their case. It doesn't matter if you are, married to a U.S. citizen or have U.S. citizen children. It doesn't matter if you have other community ties or have like a particular job here. Like none of those sort of like societal conditions, whatever community questions are at play, or even like questions around, like a lot of times when at that point there was 3 crimes that were considered that would be subject to mandatory detention, and they were called aggravated felonies, which in the immigration context is neither, it doesn't have to be aggravated, it doesn't have to be a felony, it could be misdemeanor convictions. They just low-level crimes. It's really a huge expansion happened from 88 to the 90s, 96. And so all these people, and this is really the way, you start to see more and more people, more and more immigrants funneled into the system because mass incarceration is growing. So you have more police on the streets, more prisons being built, and immigrants are in community. And so they're both being punished for whether they get a sentence or not for the crime that they are being prosecuted for, but they're also then, after, say, they serve a sentence, they're then being transferred to immigrant detention. Sometimes not, sometimes they're released, but then sometimes ICE will do a home raid or something like that. So in 1996, you see this just like massive expansion of mandatory detention in terms of who could be applied, who it could be applied to, and also the category of aggravated felony where it's like 20, 30 plus crimes. And the big distinction here is you go from this sort of paradigm of resident versus non-resident to citizen versus non-citizen. So if you were a legal permanent resident, or if you had a visa to be in the country, it didn't actually matter, and you could still be longtime community residents, people who are here for a long time, overnight because they had a conviction, could be detained, could be deported. And you see this doubling of the detention system after 96, and it just sort of expands from there. And the last thing I'll say is I think, for a lot of people who were adults in 9/11, since I know a lot of folks weren't young, but I think that, in that moment where we are all processing the pre-post 9/11 moment, I think a lot of people understand 9/11 as this moment, but actually the foundation of those laws were completely sort of set at that point. And what happened after 9/11 was that, the sort of war on terror generally, we understand it as like what's happening in Iraq and Afghanistan, and a lot of resources and capital into the Department of Defense. But in the domestic war on terror, it really operated through the criminal legal system. And by 2004, immigration crimes actually become the number one crime in the federal courts. And so that's not even just people who are in civil detention where they're waiting their immigration proceeding, but also people who are in criminal incarceration, U.S. Marshal Service, Federal Bureau of Prisons, serving 6 months, sometimes 2 years, sometimes 20 years in prison because of an immigration crime, which is usually entering the country without documentation or doing it twice or maybe having a drug crime connected to it. So the snowballing of the system really starts happening at that point. And I think on the question about abolition, I mean, so much of what I'm arguing in this book is we can't really, like, all the logics that applied to make mass incarceration a thing to like target Black, poor, indigenous communities, et cetera. Like all those also apply to immigrant detention. So a lot of times what happens in the immigrant rights world is to sort of push this idea that immigrants are better, or like there's something like that to make the case for them. So immigrants commit less crimes than US citizens do, which is both like not a helpful message, and because it still kind of purports that immigration is connected to public safety, which it's not at all. But also it's like pretty anti-Black to say that. And so I think there's all these ways that we reinforce all these frames about immigration and public safety, and reinforce all these frames that led us to have the largest system of mass incarceration in the world when we're fighting for immigrants. So part of the reason why the argument I'm making around abolition is like, actually, we need to understand it as a whole system and stop actually pitting our communities against each other.
Thanks. That's a really helpful way. I thought you writing about the 90s and this rise of mass incarceration and how that goes along with this question of deportations is really helpful. So thinking about bringing people into that system, right, arresting them, detaining them, criminalizing them, then allows for deportation and sets up the immigration system to take over.
Yeah, and I mean, the one thing I'd say there is that, I don't know if we're going to talk about Obama, but like those like federal, like the thing is, as deportations went up, you had people who were being deported and then trying to come back, and then it would trigger a reentry prosecution, and then they would end up in the federal prison system. So it was just this snowball effect that kept happening.
Yeah, well, let's talk about Obama, maybe. I think it's worth just saying, we probably should have started the show here, but just the situation is so dire right now in some ways, right? In terms of all of the press and the media and the anxiety around immigration right now. But to take a step back from that, the mass movements have had some success in the recent past. I mean, of course, I think about where you left off that story of A Day Without an Immigrant and all of the huge, massive May Day marches that happened in the late aughts, I guess it was. But you write about DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is often considered one of Obama's big victories, and that it was really the result of grassroots mobilization. So I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about some of these movements that follow, where we had some successes, where immigrant rights felt like it was maybe on the move a little bit, and there was some potential for moving in a different direction and some pushback. And how can movements, more generally push back against this really rightward shift that we're in right now on border policy?
I know it's like so critical that we remember that actually movements had impact here and things shifted because of them, and it's hard to feel that right now. And so I do think, the Obama period was so transformative for so many reasons. Also, at some level, this is what I've been feeling for the last 3.5 years, which is like Obama was a much more compelling target in every way than Biden is. So there's that to it too. But I do think what we saw a few different things happen. One was there's just this burgeoning and flourishing immigrant youth movement that is starting to really, push for the DREAM Act, but then just more broadly push for stopping deportations and also unpacking some of the really messed up frames about how they came here as no fault of their own and they're valedictorians and whatever. They sort of started rejecting that idea and just being oh no, we want to fight for everyone and we want to fight for our people and we're going to put our lives on the line actually in that context. And so that's happening, and that is, especially happening towards the end of the Bush administration, really starting to grow under the Obama administration. And then there's just this huge, because of the way Obama approached his reforms during that period, early on to position himself away from what Bush did, but also to make the play for comprehensive immigration reform. So that it's sort of the end of the really massive worksite raids that were so harmful to communities in Iowa and other places, and saying, no, we're going to use the criminal legal system to target people. But actually what happened, because we have the, one of the largest apparatuses in the world of this system, so many more people were funneled in. There was much more racial profiling. Obama got coined deporter-in-chief. You had the highest level of these formal deportations where people are removed and then have a 5-year bar to reentry and could get prosecuted on the way back. So it's just this massive blow to immigrant communities because you see so many more people being deported and people are feeling their loved ones being taken from them. And then you have, SB 1070 in 2010, which is the quote unquote show me your papers law, this really awful criminalizing immigrants law that happens in Arizona that also just garners a lot of attention on how severe enforcement was getting and how Republicans responding, but also how Obama was not actually intervening enough. It took a while for him to intervene. And more civil disobedience, really 2010, you start to see a lot more civil disobedience within, in Arizona, with dreamers across the country, people, immigrant youth, just coming out of the shadows. And I'm I'm doing air quotes. I realize I'm on a podcast, but I think there was like a vibrancy to those movements. And then on this sort of like other realm of things, you also have the Black Lives Matter movement really, really growing. You see uprisings in Ferguson and other places. And there's this way that the immigrant justice movement starts to really understand the criminal legal system and the fact that the immigrant justice fight is actually a racial justice fight. Like for so many years, that wasn't actually a part of the conversation. It was like, no, actually, these are intertwined fights. And so from my perspective, all of those things combined, you get to things like DACA, which imperfect in a lot of ways, but instead of saying, oh, we're going to have these like piecemeal ways to get people out or have alternatives to detention or have these other things that actually haven't led to decarceration or haven't led to less deportations, you have this like big program benefiting some 800,000 people, so much more significant than a lot of the other sort of like smaller things that Obama was doing. And it was only because, I mean, even, this was 12 years ago now, where it's essentially the 12-year anniversary of DACA this month. Obama, like campaign offices, like sit-ins were happening, like people were doing, people were just, again, putting their lives on the line, sort of like going after the campaign, going after members of Congress and making just like broader connections around the criminal legal system because of what was happening. And so I think that from there, there's other things that Obama does at that point, but really DACA is probably the most significant reform. I think like post-Obama, I think what's really interesting is that because that framework that Obama pushed constantly, which is like, well, you have the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant, and the bad immigrant are the immigrants who have interaction with the criminal legal system. That didn't play as well. Like under the Trump administration, all that sort of like the veneer was off, and it was actually much easier for us to get a lot more states to pass sanctuary laws. So from my perspective, a lot of what shifted, and and there's complication, that's also not perfect, but I think when you look at deportations and how things shifted from Obama's first term to now, where it was just rampant deportations of community members, really, really high levels, some 400,000 a year, and some of those were border, but a lot of them were interior, you see like that really, really start to go down. And under Trump, with these sanctuary policies and having things like DACA and also temporary protected status for more countries, it actually just becomes really unpopular to target community members. And you don't have, it goes from down to like under 200,000 formal removals, formal deportations. And so that was like hugely significant. So, in some ways, I think everyone's just like, oh, nothing's, and it's like, no, like actually, it is not politically popular anymore to target community members. And sadly, because the movement and Democrats have failed to have any real vision around the border, that's really dictating everything right now in terms of the conversation. And that's hard because it makes it harder for us to make the case for people, both people who are coming and people who live here. But we did shift that. We shifted away from this idea that having ICE collaborate with police, deporting young immigrants, yeah. So I think that's, and it was only movement that did that, right? It was really Obama making a play in 2012 around DACA after so much civil disobedience, after so much pressure, and then, of course, leading up to the election.
Yeah, and you talk about this connection between ICE and police forces and also detention centers and the private prison industry, right? And this expansion that really exploded in the 80s and 90s. Can you talk a little bit about the connection between the private prison industry and that role that it plays in so-called immigration reform?
Yeah, and I'm really critical of the idea that private prisons are like the main problem. I don't actually think they are, but I think the thing is private prisons have really understood immigration as their sort of like core way to expand the system, even if private prisons exist outside of immigration. But, the first private prison that was built in this sort of like modern version of the last like 40 years or so was actually in Houston, Texas, the Houston Processing Center. And it's an immigrant detention center by Corrections Corporation of America, which is now Core Civic. From my perspective, a lot of it is just, it's a period of time when neoliberalism is on the rise and there's this real intensive kind of, especially Reagan approach to small government. And so private prisons were sort of the answer. It was like, oh, okay, we need to expand INS detention, immigration detention. And it's really expensive. I mean, ICE only actually owns and operates 5 of the some 200 detention centers that are in use. The rest are either subcontracted out to county jails or private prisons. And so it was expensive for them to do that. And we're like, well, they were just like, well, we're just going to, work with Corrections Corporation of America, at the time, Wackenhut, which is now Geo Group, and other smaller private prison companies, and start expanding that way, in addition to using a lot of those county jails that were meant for short-term stays, but sometimes people would spend years in them, usually with no outdoor space, no way to get fresh sunlight, really, really horrible conditions. And on the conditions front, they're all pretty equally bad. There's no like, oh, this is, and so I think the one thing I would say that is important to keep in mind, because Biden was very vocal about this, and Clinton in 2016 was very vocal about this, where it was like the Democrats had just like accepted the rhetoric around private prisons being bad. Mm-hmm. And so then they would just repeat that rhetoric, but then not actually do a lot in response. And when you look at the Obama administration, it's really instructive to see, because it's a combination of things. One, it's conditions in detention centers were really bad when Obama came into office. I mean, they were still really bad, but there had been numerous deaths in detention, and there was this big New York Times expose and Washington Post expose about it, and just conditions were terrible. And they were like, okay, well, they made this like sort of conscious choice to be like, well, immigrant detention, people aren't serving a criminal sentence, it's civil detention, so we're going to make it better. And at the time when Obama came into office, maybe like 50%, less than 50% of the some 34,000 beds were operated by private prison companies. But their way to approach it was like, we're going to consolidate and stop using so many county jails, and we're going to create nicer facilities. And the private prison companies were ready to play ball. And also there was a revolving door. You had all these like ICE officials who are now working for private prison companies, and there was just like a constant communication there. And by the end of Obama's time in office, when we had 40,000 detention beds used at any given time, it was some 70% of detention facilities were private. So it went from less than 50 to 70. Now, even though Biden has come out very strongly against private prisons, we're closer to 90% of immigrant detention is operated by private prison companies. And I think the thing that tells me is that actually the government is completely aligned with the private prison agenda. That's why private prisons exist. It's not, and when you look at the broader system of prisons and jails and mass incarceration in the US, it's only actually 7% of facilities are operated by private prison companies. So you can I think there's this perspective that because it's private, it's like connected to the market, but it's actually like all prisons and jails are. All prisons and jails are about a political economy. In all of these situations, and even on this sort of question of lobbying, when you look at members of Congress who are supportive of private prisons, it has less to do with whether ALEC is giving them money or whether these intense lobbying forces are there, as much as it has to do with the fact that they have a private prison in their community that, community members are dependent on the jobs. So that was that's like a lot of ideas, but I think the point I would just say about private prisons is that it provides a little bit of a unique space for us to call out the Democrats and how hypocritical they are, because they've just they're continuing to use private prison companies. They're aligned with their agenda, and they're lying about it. and then, but I also think our best bet of getting rid of them is actually just calling for the end of all detention, because they want to do detention, and private prisons are their best way to do it, right? Yeah.
Where are these detention centers geographically? Are they kind of centered in Texas and around the borders, or all over the place?
They're all over the place. I think that's the thing. Mostly we've actually been really successful in a lot of campaigns. And so places like Illinois and Maryland and New Jersey, Oregon, that used to have a lot of detention centers, especially New Jersey and Illinois, no longer do, because we've been very successful. But we from Florida to California on the border, there's tons of detention. And we saw a really big rise in detention in Louisiana, for instance, and during the Trump era, because actually there was some criminal justice reforms that reduced the prison population there, but they had all these empty beds, and Trump came in and sort of made them ICE detention centers. But, there's a detention center 2 hours from me here in Washington State in Tacoma. And there's a few things that happen. I mean, and all of it's sort of changing depending on what's happening and who's coming in. But as there have been wins on sanctuary policy, actually the number of people entering the system in Washington State or in, Oregon, where Oregon actually has like some of the best sanctuary policy in the country, has reduced. So but you see now people being like shipped from the border, or you see like people coming from different places. And there's still some incentive to target people in the community because they have, like Northwest Detention Center has a guaranteed minimum that says they're going to pay for a certain number of beds no matter what. So yeah, detention's kind of all over the country. Recently, about 3 weeks ago, right before they put out the really terrible executive order sort of banning asylum, ICE indicated its desire to build facilities in the Illinois area, which probably means Indiana, since Illinois has banned detention, in the Utah area, and then also in South Texas. So they're already like, they were in a different place where they're like, we're going to reduce detention, we're going to shift these things. We actually had all these wins, and now it's the 180 of, okay, let's expand again, which is kind of like, I mean, it's a constant struggle. This is sort of what we're constantly in.
Yeah, I wonder with that, actually, I want to move to, we want to talk about Biden and today, but I actually want to talk about that for a second. I live in Chicago, and you talk about the win here to stop immigrant detention, and it's really interesting because one of the things that you can see as a result, well, it's a result of many things, of course, and you could talk about this, but one of the results is that there's a very large homeless immigrant population, right? Especially since the crisis at the border, the so-called crisis at the border, and the immigrant population seeking asylum that have been shipped by Texas's governor, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things is, I'm really interested in what you talk about abolition, right? Not just as sort of what are we taking down, what are we trying to get rid of, but what are we trying to build up? And it feels like we're at that, the movement is at that step of how do we actually then take the next step of building up, right? We may have stopped the immigrant detention, which is really great, not having people in cages here, indefinite detention, not knowing where they can go. But there is a question of what happens now. How do we house and get jobs for and make community and make space for these immigrant populations that are just being treated so terribly? So I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that, because you say, I think, want to quote the book, you argue that no singular step will accomplish abolition, which I think is really helpful. We need to think about this as a process and as something much longer. And you highlight the need for non-reformist reforms. So I'm just hoping you could talk about that a little bit, both those non-reformist reforms, but what we also think about building up, or what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, really good questions. I mean, I think it's hard to talk about a place like Chicago without unpacking the sort of bigger climate of what Abbott's been able to accomplish, because what he's really, really succeeded in. He's basically dictating all immigration policy right now to some degree. And the Biden and the Democrats are letting him get away with it. And what has sort of happened is he's called their bluff, and he's just been like, look, I'm going to bus huge numbers of people to sanctuary cities like New York City and Chicago and Denver. Whereas if Biden were playing some sort of role here and helping, it wouldn't actually be that intense for Chicago. It's not that, it's just like they're funneling people into these particular places. And it's also, exposing how much the social safety nets that used to exist in our communities have really, especially in the sort of pandemic era, and as people have lived in this like new era of things, like exposed how much there is a housing crisis. There are these real questions of people's ability to take care of themselves, or like how much they're being abandoned by the state, essentially. And that's not just for immigrants, that's for everybody in, like, so many people who live in New York and Chicago, in places where there might not be as much resources. Like, you even had, like, I feel like there was like a sort of a report that showed that like 10 years ago in New York, actually, you had some similar numbers coming, and it wasn't actually the drain on the city in the same way, because some of those social safety nets were there. There weren't other things kind of happening. And now, whenever like New York's struggling in all these different ways, actually, this is becoming even that much more of a drain in terms of the right to shelter and all these other questions. And so, from my perspective, so much of this is exposing how actually dire conditions for a lot of people in the US are, not just for immigrants. And so I think that's what's so hard. And, we've been doing some public opinion research around what's happening at the border and how we talk about it in the context of pushing against detention. And when we sort of lean into that framing of, look, you have all these resources going to immigration enforcement, to the military, to, these really, really harmful things, and very little resources going to education and healthcare and nutrition and all the other things that we need in our lives, and public housing, that's not good. And if we we actually we have the resources, we have the ability to welcome people, to support people, but because of mass social inequality, we are in this place. And if we were to, instead of focusing on this piece of the pie, actually, how do we make the whole pie bigger? How do we shift in that way? And so it's not going to be easy, because I think at some level, from my perspective, the best case of making a case for immigration and supporting immigrants who are coming to the border, or who are seeking to migrate, or having more legal pathways, is making conditions for people in the US better. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, we have to. And I think that also is getting to this question around abolition, where actually so many Black, brown, poor, indigenous, working class communities that are feeling the brunt of having our economy centered on the carceral system and on the military and other things, as opposed to things that are helping us. And so that's all really big and lofty. But in this instance of Chicago, and I have to say, I wrote a little case study on the work in Illinois, and it just absolutely, even writing it was just so inspiring. I knew the stories. I watched it happen, but to be able to see, and for folks who are listening, Illinois had the most incredible game of whack-a-mole of stopping the detention expansion that I had ever seen, and about to probably get back into it. And I have no doubts about the abilities of the organizers and the folks who done work there. But yeah, I think it's just so much of this is about us making those connections, because we often, and this is sort of the title of the book, Unbuild Walls, we have so many walls between our social movements because we're all kind of siloed, and the nonprofit industrial complex forces us to kind of focus in on things and misses the sight of the bigger things. But actually, houseless populations and the number of people in pretrial detention, there is a correlation there. There is a lot of correlations to be made. And how can we make the case for everybody? So from my perspective, in a place like Chicago, it's finding those ways to bridge and say, okay, what are the social safety nets that everyone needs? Yes, immigrants and other people who are in need, and how to start building those up and moving, divesting from the things that aren't helping community and investing in those things that do.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I wanted to ask you a little bit about sort of these intersecting movements, right? Because you write that the fight for immigrant justice is a fight for racial, gender, and economic justice, which it seems so centrally important, right? For many reasons. And you've just talked about that, really. But I wonder if you might then just say another word about an example of what that looked like maybe talk about the Illinois example, or another example where people really did see this question of economic justice, racial justice, gender justice, crossing borders, unbuilding those walls, working together.
Yeah. Oh, I'm not sure if I'm going to have a perfect example, but I'm definitely going to think about that. I think there's just, I don't know. I feel like the part of what I'm arguing, because I think in so many ways, many people see these systems and are like, okay, the U.S. is racist. Of course, the U.S. is racist. Like in reality, it's based on like the absolute history. There's no getting around that. But I think the thing I want people to really get across is that these are just like these systems are so tied to a political economy, and so in a place like for instance, I write about this a little bit in the book, like. In California, for instance, like one of their strategies recently has been to sort of talk about, well, what is building a healthy economy? And these are sort of the conversations we started having with communities in New Mexico or in other places and saying, okay, well, it's not necessarily true that everybody wants to be a prison guard or that wants to be the job that's being offered or end up in the military, right? And abolition is about like, actually, these shouldn't just be the options. Like there should be other options. And so in California, they passed something called the HEAL Act, which is very small, like $5 million, but it basically is a way for, through this effort called the Budget to Save Lives, where they actually came together with groups like CURB, which is Californians for United for a Responsible Budget, which comes out of like some history around critical resistance and abolition, but really understanding the role that the budget plays. And what HEAL does is say, okay, we're gonna have a chunk of money for localities that are choosing to move away from immigrant detention and have some resources for job training or other things that could help, the community in the context of, so many of these places are prison towns. So many of these places are sort of like, that's how they operate. And so I think that, to me, is where you start to see some of those intersections of, okay, what could this look like outside of us just accepting that we're going to have prison towns and that's the way things are going to be. But I think, I like so many of my examples in the book are just like, we got this one win, but actually it's unfortunate because what we ended up seeing is the recycling of beds, and in like the Louisiana example or in New Jersey even, where it's just like, okay, well, we won this campaign, but we're actually going to incarcerate people who are from another county now so we can keep making the revenue. And I think in all of these instances, if there were more connection between movement, there would be some ability to sort of predict what is going to happen and also some ability to kind of make a bigger case against incarceration.
That's great. Yeah. Unfortunately, we can't let you go without talking about the election a little bit. And of course, immigration has emerged as a key issue. Biden doing away with asylum protections. What do you make of this sort of? He seems to be wanting to have it both ways, and this other executive action saying that he wants to keep families of undocumented members together. The right wing shift, and Trump's rhetoric. If you can even keep up with Trump's rhetoric. What do you make of all of this, and what can the movement for immigrant rights and abolition of detention centers and in general do about this? And like, how should we be approaching the election?
Like where to begin with this? I know the Trump rhetoric is just so wild, like him constantly like comparing immigrants to Hannibal Lecter. It's just like banana stuff at this stage where you're
and he said he wants to bomb Mexico. I mean, it's
it's just like so bananas. In so many ways, like what we just saw this last month. So what we saw this last month was basically in 3 weeks ago or whenever, I don't know when this is coming out, but basically in June, what we saw early June is Biden put out an executive order that is essentially gutting asylum at the border, putting a sort of bigger asylum ban, even harsher than some of the Senate bills that were proposed in the last 6-8 months. And really going hard on this idea of toughening the border. And then around then also announcing, ICE announced like the expansion of detention. The Department of Justice announced increased immigration-related prosecutions at the border, which was a lot of what that apparatus is what Trump used to have the family separations of 2018. So that happens. 2 weeks later, Biden announces an executive order for this, like it's hard because you want to, I'm really happy for the people who are going to benefit, which will probably be somewhat limited from what they say because it's like 6 months before the election. But for undocumented spouses who've been in the country of U.S. citizens who've been in the country for 10 years, I mean, just an unbelievably small number. Like it's just so, it's very frustrating because it's like, yes, I'm so happy for people who will benefit. And this is like 3 years later, and like nothing's really happened to like support a lot of people. And we're supposed to celebrate this like it's like a DACA win or something. It was very strange, but it's such a clear calculation on Biden's part to be like, look, I did something, now Latina voters vote for me. And that's like this response. But the thing about this last month is that it's basically been the logic of the strategy for the last 20 plus years. And the strategy for the last 20 plus years is, quote unquote, comprehensive immigration reform, which means some good stuff, legalization or a path to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented people, or at least a portion of them, trading off increased border militarization, increased criminalization. I mean, even in this latest thing for undocumented spouses, there is like criminal bars and there, you know, so criminalization, and that's the answer. And this is, and like, it's kind of wild to see how much this strategy has basically moved everything to the right and ceded more and more and more ground to the right. And, you know, I write about 2013 in the book, but that was such a particular moment of like, oh, wow, Obama finally got to this place where there's like a moment where we could have comprehensive immigration reform. The Senate bill, there was this big Senate bill that had like a 13-year path to citizenship. It was like, it's unbelievable how it feels really hard to even celebrate that, right? So then there's that, but then on the flip side, there was all these horrible border measures, and then there was this border surge amendment. So it was like 4.6 billion for border, but then it went to like, or 6 billion or something, but then it went to like 40 something billion for border militarization, and included a rise in prosecutions. Like, I mean, it was just so horrifying how much it went to the right. And then the Democrats just accepted it. They just totally accepted it. And that bill passed, and then it never moved in the House. But part of the thing was the immigrant rights movement accepted it, the Democrats accepted it, and people weren't necessarily like, this is amazing, but they still just said, okay, this is fine. We'll do all the border militarization in the world just to get this stuff. And now here we are. And that's like all we've seen is that the sort of understanding of what toughening the border has gone that much further extreme and that much like more draconian. Mm-hmm. And actually the ability to fight for people who are living here now, it's, you know, it's people who've been here for 10 years and are married to a US citizen. It's a really, really like small population. So anyways, just to say, it's very frustrating to be in this place because it's, and you know, there's this poll that came out recently that was like, oh, Americans want want people in the country to have relief, but they also want more deportations. And that's because this is what Democrats have been telling them for years, is that's what we want. And so it's a really frustrating moment in terms of what we can do. Sorry, I digress. But I think I think that this is a really hard moment, and I think people are really angry in the movement. People are really frustrated, and this is the time to sort of offer that vision. Like, what if actually the conversations we were having in 2013 were about how to expand freedom of movement, how to make the border less militarized, how to create the right to return for like immigrant communities that have been deported, and their ability to return and not accept this like idea that the criminal legal system was the way to do this. And in 2020, when during the George Floyd uprisings, that was our best case as an immigrant justice movement to make the case against these things. But there's been so much backlash. So we're really struggling in this moment. And I think the best thing that we can do is offer a lot of that vision and then go back to the basics and say, okay, this is the time to build up the base. This is the time to get prepared for whatever is going to come after the 2024 election, which in the case of Trump, we know it's going to be National Guard troops rounding up people, potentially massive detention camps, mass deportation. It's going to be really awful. And I think we're going to have to figure out a way to do everything we can to protect our communities. In the case of Biden, I think the thing that's really hard to reckon with is that if Biden wins, which I hope he does in November, it's going to tell them that their rightward turn on immigration was the right move. And so I think we're going to have to do a lot of work to push back on that and push back on the fact that there's going to be more of these anti-immigrant state bills, like in Texas and Florida and Arizona. And so we have our work cut out for us, but I do think from my perspective, having an abolitionist lens on it is going to help us kind of know what are the things that we should fight for and not just accept the sort of piecemeal crumbs that they constantly give us.
Yeah, absolutely. We want to make sure that our listeners can keep up with the work that you're doing, this really important work. And obviously, it's always a crucial time, but right now feels particularly important. So is there anything, you have any speaking? I know you just came up, maybe you're just done with your book tour, but do you have any speaking engagements coming up? Anything you're writing that we should be looking out for? Anything we should be looking out for from Detention Watch?
Yeah, I'm going to be, my first time, I'm going to Netroots, but I'm going to be at Red Emma's in Baltimore in a few weeks, which I'm excited about. And yeah, I think, with Detention Watch Network, I mean, we work with groups all across the country who are fighting to shut down detention centers, who are working to stop expansion, but also trying to we bring a lot of different groups together who are kind of contending with similar things. So even these anti-immigrant state bills, we're trying to bring those folks together and sort of think about strategy. And I encourage folks to check out our website. If you're in one of these places that you want to engage in some of these campaigns, I'm sure we have people there who we can connect you with. And our goal is to really build up that grassroots organizing and that work to kind of do everything we can to shift things.
Yeah, this has been really, really great to have you here. So Baltimore, come on out to Red Emma's. I think you're going to be in Chicago at the end of this summer.
Yeah, the socialism conference. And
we'll all be there. So
I'll be there as well.
Wonderful. With fellow Haymarket author. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And then people should definitely check out Detention Watch and try to get involved where you can.
And to all of the listeners of CounterPunch Radio, go out and check out the book. Go to the library, demand that they carry it, Unbuild Walls by Silky Shah, and order it from your favorite independent bookstore or anywhere else you can find it. Thanks so much for joining us today, Silky. It was a real pleasure, and this is a really important book, and you're doing great work, so keep it up.
Thanks so much for having me.